Hey, good day, everybody. This is Mike Leibovitz, host of On the Fly Wi-Fi. We have an excellent episode today. I'm really excited actually to be able to focus on K-12, some topics around education, and I think we've got an unbelievable thought leader and expert, Wi-Fi expert with us today, Andrew Von Nagy. Andrew, thank you for joining us today. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, some of your passion, also known as Revolution Wi-Fi. You have some pretty amazing blogs that are posted out there. But why don't you give us a little bit of your background and what you like about Wi-Fi?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast, Mike. It's my pleasure to be here today with you. My background, I work today with Education Networks of America. I'm a mobility architect there. We're a service provider that provides all range of services in networking and telecommunications infrastructure for K-12 education and libraries. Prior to that, I've worked in large enterprise and retail, as well as a little bit on the Wi-Fi manufacturer side. And I actually, early in my career, I spent a good number of years as a K-12 system administrator myself.
Yeah.
So, the good old days of interning in college and, getting a summer job with the local school district and pulling cable. And that was the roots of, my IT career. So very happy to be here with you today talking about education.
Excellent. So we know E-rate is probably, one of the hottest topics. I'd say, if you talk about Wi-Fi over the last 8 to 12 months, E-rate certainly dominates in terms of conversation without question around K-12. You and I are not E-rate experts, and certainly we're not here to discuss particulars around E-rate filing and all the other fun things that the experts get to do and talk about. But without question, there is a thrust for Wi-Fi in K-12. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the trends and some of the push and motivation behind the FCC's push to get Wi-Fi infused learning in the K-12 market nationwide?
Yeah, I think there's been a huge push both from the White House as well as the FCC to fund internal connections within buildings, specifically to address the need of technology in classrooms for, technology-based or technology-infused learning within the classroom for students. So I believe the FCC has modified the E-rate or the Universal Service Fund rules for this year moving forward, and I believe they've pledged over $5 billion. The number keeps floating, but I think it was around $5 billion over the next several years. And I've heard only part of that is actually concretely funded so far. I believe like $2 billion out of that. But you look at the huge influx of money provided through universal service funding to K-12 educators to deploy in classroom technology. What E-rate classifies now as Category 2, previously Priority 2. And so that's really just connections inside the building. So Wi-Fi is a big driver of that, since there's the huge adoption with one-to-one initiatives and mobile devices. So with all this money and funding coming in, there's a lot of interest and demand to deploy more Wi-Fi in schools and better Wi-Fi that can handle all of these devices coming in.
Gotcha. So I guess even from the top, I think one of the interesting parts with K-12, you get into all sorts of different conversations. In your opinion, is Wi-Fi in K-12 different? Is there something different in terms of how we're deploying, what we're thinking about, but just even from a broad perspective, is it different? It always seems like it's kind of on its own island in terms of conversation, what K-12 is trying to do with Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent you see that difference across all of the different verticals, whether it's hospitality, retail, healthcare, enterprise, or education, or universities. They all kind of have their own spin on how they deploy Wi-Fi. I think I look at it in a couple different fashions. Number one is the framework of all the different components with Wi-Fi and the solutions around it, not only the infrastructure, but the security and policy services around it, and the integration, let's say, with the wired network. A lot of those framework pieces are very consistent across all of the verticals. But what we find that varies, and I think especially in K-12 education, is how you put those pieces together to deliver a solution, right? So we've got all the bits and pieces, and how we arrange them and how we put them together varies by vertical. So in education, I think, budget constraints are always typically a number one priority.
Yeah.
You're always looking for a cost-effective solution since it's taxpayer-funded money, and usually technology has to compete with a lot of other initiatives within in the schools, like textbooks and curriculum purchases and things like that. So we look at cost-effective deployment of wireless infrastructure. We're looking at a lot of one-to-one initiatives, a lot of BYOD, so funding of devices themselves is coming out of the technology budgets. Wi-Fi has to, in essence, compete with that and draw from the same budget or project funding. And then we're looking at, historically, we haven't seen a ton of security demand within education, I would say. We're starting to see that more and more with BYOD and devices coming in. So they're looking for, again, cost-effective mobile device management, cost-effective onboarding of personal devices. And so those traditional solutions that have been built for other verticals like large enterprise, we're seeing kind of, to an extent, scaled down or light versions of those or the basics of those coming into education at a much more cost-effective price point for them.
Gotcha. So when you start a conversation with a K-12 customer, whether it's an IT or CIO, what's usually your starting point? What's the most important elements that you want to understand from a customer before, hopefully you can gather requirements before you go out and design or try to implement anything. Just the other day I was talking to a CIO of a fairly large K-12 school system who mentioned, they probably average around 5 devices per student, which kind of blew my mind for K-12 because that's sort of more a number you'd hear in higher ed. But they see more and more devices per student in K-12. Usually it's 1 to 2 devices is what I've always thought in K-12, but seemingly there's more and more. So going back to the requirements, where do you like to start a conversation? What's sort of the most important if you're building a checklist, things that you really need to understand of what that particular customer, what that school system is trying to achieve?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you my ideal world, and then I'll tell you that in a lot of cases, I don't get to have the ideal conversation that I want to have.
Yeah.
So I actually take it a step back from the technology requirements, and I actually, if I had my preference, would be able to establish a good, solid relationship with the customer at the superintendent or technology coordinator level, and try to understand how they're going to use technology in the classroom to better kind of their lesson planning and curriculum. Because I think a big portion that is kind of overlooked a lot of times in education is we're throwing a lot of technology into the classroom,
yep,
but the educators themselves are not necessarily equipped or trained to know how to use it in the classroom to further the instructional efforts that they're trying to achieve and the goals they're trying to achieve. So I like to talk to superintendents a lot about how are you integrating technology into your lesson plans. Not that I'm an expert, I'm definitely not, but I want to make sure that they are thinking about those things, and maybe our conversation is a trigger for that. That they get teachers training on how to integrate, let's say, tablets or Chromebooks or something into their curriculum and lesson and day-to-day use in the classroom, and for them to have small incremental steps, not no technology to one-to-one. They need to start understanding small use cases, small wins with their teachers, especially to gain adoption. I think if you just throw a whole bunch of technology on the teachers, a lot of them are going to be resistant or not know how to use it. So ideally, I like to have those conversations and just kind of understand where they're at in that process, if they're ready for technology, or if we need to maybe scale back a little bit the expectation of what the technology is going to do in the classroom. Because that's where it kind of leads into is what's actually expected to be used in the classroom. Is it going to be full-fledged, digital lesson plans only in the classroom, or are they going to use it as a supplement to what they're already doing, and just say, start watching videos or start doing, pop quizzes electronically or surveys electronically or shared presentations and discussion. I mean, so you kind of lead into, how are your teachers going to start using it, and that really drives then how the Wi-Fi and the infrastructure is going to start to be used.
Do you find, or have you found in some of these conversations, perhaps those that are starting to get into Wi-Fi, that are moving into more of a digital learning space, that the technology's further ahead than where they're ready to go? I mean, is that something that you're seeing often, or do you think the technology is aligning the Wi-Fi and the devices with what's really capable in terms of improving the education of the students and the outcomes ultimately of the students?
I would say, number one, technology is an amazing thing, and from a teacher's perspective, the technology is for a lot of teachers that aren't necessarily tech savvy because they may be, older and didn't grow up with it, like Generation Y or kids today.
The millennial.
They don't have that familiarity, let's say, that the children in their classrooms even have with the technology. So there's a learning curve for them to get up to speed on how to use the technology. But at the same time, the technology is kind of, I would say, an imperfect fit for classroom and education right now. A lot of things that are geared toward education or put into classrooms don't necessarily work the most efficient or effective way for that environment. So I think we're kind of adapting technology from home and enterprise use for education use, and it's not a perfect fit. So I think there's gaps on both sides. There's the human side where we just need to figure out how to best train the teachers and educators, and they need to figure out how to integrate it into their lesson plans. And then number two is the technology needs to adapt and change to fit what they're trying to do better.
Gotcha.
So it's kind of an imperfect fit at this point, I would say.
So once you're past kind of a business conversation, let's say with the superintendent or CIO, and you got a little bit more of an understanding of what they're hoping to achieve, probably you're looking at multiple years, right? Because as you said, typically K-12 has constrained budgets, so they're not looking to upgrade their environment every year or two. They're expecting it to last, 3 to 5 years or more. Once you get past that business level of conversation, where do you start going in terms of being ready to design, to walk into a school? What's kind of your starting process if you're being asked to come in and have a look at a school and perhaps start doing a site survey? What starts entering your mind at that point?
Yeah, the first thing I do is I want to have a sit down and have a good conversation with the technical coordinator within a building or a facility that is going to have Wi-Fi deployed or has an existing Wi-Fi network that we're looking to upgrade or migrate away from. So I go through a pretty comprehensive discussion around the square footage of the building, the layout, the classrooms, what the use in the different areas are. So some classrooms, and this is one of the big, traditional struggles with education, is classrooms change their use case from year to year. Yeah. This used to be a big problem with like computer labs where they'd wire up a whole room for 30, 50 computers, and then the next school year, they'd want the computer lab in a different room, and so you'd have to, over the summer, pull all new cable plant into the new room, and there's a big effort. With wireless, it's getting a little bit easier with that because you don't have, there's not quite so much effort to move those rooms around. But we are seeing, definitely different use cases. Let's say if you have a K-12 and let's say it's an elementary school and it also has a middle school and it's all in one building, you get varying use cases between, let's say, the very young students and what they're using technology for in certain classrooms, and then the older students in middle school type age of what they're using it for. So that impacts, let's say, your density of devices that the school is deploying. So maybe the younger kids don't all get one-to-one. They don't get all their own device, but as you move and progress up in the grades, it might start rolling out one device per student at a certain grade level. So I look for the density in different areas, use cases in different areas, what they use the common areas for. So some schools do standardized testing, for instance, in the cafeteria or the gym. When they put in, roll all those students in for the standardized testing, how many students are they putting in there at once? And so we're really starting to build a design around the density and use cases in different areas of the facility. We go through other questions around, the makeup of the facility itself. What are the walls constructed out of? Do you have tempered glass? Is there any outdoor coverage requirements? And then if we can get into the conversation with the tech coordinator, actually, try to get down to the level of what your teachers are planning to use it for on an application level. Are they doing video streaming? Are they doing interactive testing? Are they doing collaboration where students and the teacher can all work off of a common, let's say, shared presentation or shared document, something like that?
Gotcha. So in your opinion, in your professional opinion, the concept and the hotly debated, I know we have some friends, Devin and Keith, when you start talking about 1 AP per classroom, viability behind that sort of design, to the other side of the spectrum of, not applicable or never being applicable. Clearly, it sounds like you don't take an approach of putting one AP per classroom, but maybe you want to expand a little bit on that thought.
I'm a big advocate in doing a proper design, and that means going through, let's say, that discussion I just mentioned, and then going and actually doing a predictive or an AP on a stick kind of pre-deployment survey to understand the environment. The people who advocate one AP per classroom, I think, are trying to end around that proper design process in order to just throw enough APs in and say, we've got you handled from a capacity perspective. And so there are pitfalls and downfalls with that that I don't really think are very appropriate in education or in any environment, which are typically way too many AP radios in the environment. And when you're trying to solve them, what you're trying to do with that is to put in enough capacity for the influx of devices. And what they end up doing is having too many radios communicating over the air and actually just congesting the airtime and degrading the performance of the network. So I'm not going to be a hard line and say one AP per classroom never works. I think there are instances where it is applicable. I think they're a very subset or minority of the cases, and we advocate for a much more thorough design process to understand the appropriate amount of APs. And you know, just as a rough guideline, we typically see that fall into more of the one AP per 2 classroom type of range. Yep. And on some high density type of schools, we actually see that creep up a little bit, not all the way to one AP per classroom, but you know, if you were to average it out across the building, more like 2 APs per 3 classrooms or something in that neighborhood or range, because of just device densities or the way a building is constructed and laid out with classrooms.
And in terms of 2.4 versus 5, I mean, I know you kind of get into, you probably need to really understand at that point the device capabilities. Some schools that are doing BYOD, you know, students might be bringing in devices that are, you know, a couple of years old. Maybe it's their parents' old laptop or smartphone that only supports 2.4 in an environment that's one-to-one, or where the school system is actually supplying the device. Perhaps it's a newer Chromebook or something along those lines. But in general, 2.4 versus 5, when you're thinking of designing for K-12, is it 5 first, 2.4 after, or, you know, try to maximize and leverage both bands to cover as much as you can in terms of capacity?
So I'll say first off that 5 gigahertz primary is the approach that we typically take. Now that is dependent on what devices the school is looking to deploy or has deployed and what their capabilities are. But a lot of education now, we see a lot of influx of newer devices, and a 5 gigahertz primary design is working pretty well for us in most instances. We design around 5 gigahertz and also 2.4. We don't neglect it, but we definitely say that you know, 5 gigahertz is your high capacity, and we want to shift most of the devices over there. We try to maintain a very strong signal strength in 5 gigahertz throughout the environment, and we're a little bit more lax on what the signal strength requirement is for 2.4. So for instance, we might design a neg 65 dBm level everywhere in 5 gigahertz, and maybe a neg 70 dBm level everywhere that we guarantee in 2.4. And that does 2 things. Number one, it maintains a consciousness in our design effort that we want to prevent 2.4 gigahertz congestion. Yep. So a lot of times, even when we're doing a proper design, we end up turning off some 2.4 gigahertz radios. And actually, in almost all cases, we will have some 2.4 radios disabled. And then second thing is if on average clients are experiencing a stronger signal on 5 gigahertz, it helps. It's a natural effect to help get clients over to prefer 5 gigahertz naturally, rather than doing any band steering or anything like that. Because while band steering does work for the most part, we do run into instances where it can cause problems.
So in terms of, actually, I guess I had 2 questions in my mind, but channel widths, 20, 40, 80, do you typically stick to 20? DFS, use it or not? And have you ever seen deployments or started looking at deployments mixing dual radio and maybe single radio access points for that exact kind of use case, where maybe you don't need the additional 2.4 and maybe a single radio AP in the right spot can help that sort of scenario? So I've kind of asked a few questions there.
Yeah, so let's see, the last one, single radio versus dual radio. We with the vendor, you know, we're a managed service provider, so we've standardized on one vendor right now, and they don't offer a single radio AP, so we don't do any of that today. We just disable 2.4 radios where necessary. What were the other questions? Like,
yeah, channel width, DFS.
Oh, yeah, so DFS. So channel widths kind of lead into what DFS leads into what our channel width kind of requirement is or guideline is. So we try to always use DFS. We see very little issue with using DFS in most schools. So we use it by default, and if we run into an issue or run into some sort of radar detection issue, then we might peel back from there. Since we are using DFS, we almost always lead with 40 megahertz channels and 5 gigahertz.
Yep.
We never go to 80. We won't go to 160 when Wave 2 comes out. There's just not enough spectrum to have channel reuse. That would lead us into the same issue that we have in 2.4 with a limited number of channels and a high amount of congestion. So, and we find that most mobile devices, you know, work perfectly fine. They have enough single client throughput on 40 megahertz that we'd rather reduce interference between APs than try to give a higher single client throughput.
Yeah, I mean, and it kind of gets into an interesting conversation in terms of, you know, 11AC, Wave 1, Wave 2, probably mostly around multi-user MIMO and whether or not, based on the applications that are being run, the device types and the applications being run, if, you know, potential for Wave 2 multi-user MIMO, and these are probably more opinions at this point, is I don't think we have concrete understanding, particularly in K-12, if downlink or downstream traffic is the primary use case in K-12 that will actually see a bigger improvement with multi-user MIMO. Thoughts?
I think it'll help. I don't know to what extent yet. It'll kind of be a wait and see. You know, I think it'll have some sort of small multiplier effect in the aggregate performance of the network. But at the same time, I think it's perfectly reasonable and achievable to design a network today that meets a one-to-one initiative in classrooms and the demand that's placed on a network. So I don't think by any means it's necessary. As with anything, I think, you know, new technology comes along and rather than, you know, it's going to be a shortcut for people rather than doing a proper design just to say, oh, now we have MU-MIMO or we have this or that. We can throw bandwidth at the problem rather than doing a redesign. And so that'll you know, get some of those mediocre deployments out there that necessarily weren't designed correctly to begin with, give them a little bit more lifeline probably,
right, by
just swapping out APs or something like that. So it will be a big help for the mobile devices, I think, in education, where a good portion of the content is probably downstream, like videos, streaming, things like that. But at the same time, I think we're seeing a pretty big growth in interactive two-way content as well. Yeah. Teachers and students now with applications are interacting more, sharing content dynamically in the classroom. And I think, you know, we'll start to see that grow over time as well. So in those cases, there'll probably be a limited effect. And the other case I should mention is distance learning is huge in education. There's a lot of distance learning initiatives, especially for rural areas. Yep. So as we see more and more, and those are all typically video-based.
Yeah, two-way video, right? Both bidirectional. I got you. Cool. Do you typically think of maybe a bit rate or a bandwidth allocation in terms of a K-12 student, a typical K-12 student, you know, 1 megabit per second, 5 megabit per second? I know many people think about, you know, wave 1 and wave 2 and, you know, wider channel and multi-gigabit and all these things that kind of don't really work and aren't maybe necessarily required in the real world. Bringing that back down to kind of reality, like when you talk about 40 megahertz channel, I mean, 11N still provides a huge amount of bandwidth in a properly designed network. One could argue that 11A can provide more than enough bandwidth as well. Is there sort of a certain bit rate that you kind of think about per student, or do you not design around that kind of concept from an application consumption standpoint?
Yeah, we try to target kind of some minimum SLAs, and usually what I do I break it out usually between teacher and student because they're different use cases. Mm-hmm. Student, I usually try to plan for On laptops, somewhere around 5 megabits per second of actual throughput. On tablets, somewhere around 2 to 3 megabits per second. And on smartphones, somewhere around 1 megabit per second. But we're seeing that kind of creep up now with some of the latest generation iPads and things like that. So for instance, we've got a big project ongoing with Apple right now for their Connect Education initiative. And they are wanting, 4 to 5 megabits per second minimum SLA for every iPad going into a student's hands. So where I was doing 2 to 3 before, now we're looking at 4 to 5. And while that doesn't sound like very much, actually, when you aggregate them up of 30 students in a classroom and you've got so many classrooms in a building, your actual aggregate network capacity starts to creep up quite a bit. And then you start running into, addressing other, requirements within the network, like making sure all your APs are connected via a gigabit network drop, and it's actually operating at 1 gigabit. It hasn't fallen back to 100 meg. You look at your uplinks between switches and closets to make sure they're either multiple 1 gig bonded link aggregation links, or in some circumstances now we're even saying if it's a dense enough deployment, we're looking at upgrading fiber cabling between closets to 10 gigabits cable. So a lot of upstream requirements, and you have to take into consideration, are they hosting stuff in the school itself for content, or just going back out through an internet pipe where it's constrained there anyways. So a lot of considerations. You kind of have to take it in as a whole and figure out what the use case is and all the links in the chain.
No, I love the kind of end-to-end methodology, and certainly the layer 1 aspect of even just verifying that your link connection from AP to switch is what you believe it should be, gig hopefully, gig running full duplex, which I think is the default option, but then all the way down through, whether it's to your data center or out to your cloud, and understanding whether or not you have enough internet access, enough bandwidth to actually support the density. It's funny, well, maybe not so funny, but wireless is what's blamed when the network isn't working, when in many times the wireless is working fine and there's congestion somewhere else down. Yeah. Or maybe it's the application itself, the application server that's struggling under the load. So a lot of things to look at, right? And not necessarily just the RF side of the equation. So
yeah, I even had some users run like internet speed tests and be like, my Wi-Fi performance is slow. And then we're going, well, you're going through your internet pipe, and what's the size of that? And right. So it's a lot of it in education as well is perception oriented, right?
Yes.
You're dealing with tech coordinators, and a lot of times, they may understand technology more in depth than their teachers do. But a lot of times when you're interacting with teachers, the make or break on the wireless network is what the teacher perceives the stability and the performance of the network is, without knowing how it works. It's just when I pull up my laptop or my iPad, I know I've got a signal, and I can do what I need to do. And so that's kind of where we judge the success or failure of a network is take all the site survey, all the design, once you get it done, and does it meet what the actual teacher is going to do on a day-to-day basis when they pull out that device, or the student, and we try to do some verification around that as well.
No, you're right. Actually, it's an interesting point, because the perception oftentimes when people don't think about DHCP servers and radius authentication. If you can't get on the network's broken, even though it might be something downstream, some of the back end systems that are preventing that connection, the association to complete. But lo and behold, everyone's going to say, hey, wireless is broken. So again, it's kind of that end-to-end picture and making sure everything's working to make sure the expectations met of the end users, the staff, the teachers, and the students, right?
Yeah, and I think of a typical K-12 elementary or middle school, kind of like a retail branch office or something like that, where they've got constrained resources, meaning they've got the district may have a lot of schools to provide services for, and are those services like DHCP and Radius centralized or Active Directory, or are they trying to distribute them out to the schools? And oftentimes, if they're out in the school, it's higher survivability, but then it's increased cost. So there's that trade-off there. And you go into the schools, and how many schools have you ever been in that has a dedicated, not data center, but good rack space that is clean, has good airflow, good redundant power. So you're looking at typically servers underneath an admin's desk, in an office area crammed into a closet somewhere. And so these aren't, your highest reliability type of services. So you kind of have to do some planning around that to see if you can, maintain uptime despite some compromises in infrastructure.
Awesome. Well, we're getting to the bottom of the hour. I definitely want to hit on one kind of final element from you. If there are actually a lot of schools that don't have any Wi-Fi today. I mean, that's really part of the thrust behind E-Rate and getting Wi-Fi out there for everyone and to infuse the learning experience with technology. From your perspective, in your opinion, if you're a school board, a school system that doesn't have Wi-Fi today, where do you start? How do you start? What are your kind of best recommendations or top of mind elements that you would walk into an environment that doesn't have Wi-Fi today, and probably limited understanding or knowledge of 802.11 and RF in general?
Yeah. First thing I would say is understand at the CIO level or the district tech coordinator level what their familiarity with wireless is. I think at some certain level within the organization, they need to have a familiarity of how to appropriately evaluate and purchase Wi-Fi, as well as then evaluate and select an appropriate partner, whether that's a value-added reseller, a professional services company, or where I'm at, like a managed services company. To understand where they're at, like if they have a high skill level, maybe they're comfortable doing it in-house and just getting a VAR to sell them equipment. If they're not so comfortable, maybe they need to bring in a professional services company, but then they can manage it day to day on their own. And if they're at the other end of the spectrum, where I think a lot of school districts is they don't really know Wi-Fi very well. They focus on other things. They wear multiple hats and they put out emergency issues. They might opt for a managed service provider to say, come in and do it for us. But they have to do their due diligence in knowing how to select that type of partner in any three of those scenarios. So I'd say understand your familiarity. Build an RFP to put out to provide technology in the classrooms. And I would say don't be overly prescriptive in the RFP, because that kind of just paints yourself into a corner. I find a lot of times people put in just really weird RFP requirements into Wi-Fi that is completely not the best interests for themselves of how they need to design or deploy Wi-Fi. I've seen some RFPs with like 2-3 APs per classroom that they spec out, and it's like you're just sitting here going, that's just nuts. That's not what's best for your district, no matter who provides it. So I would say try to focus on the RFP of saying, put in there the art of the what if, right? It's like, this is what we want to accomplish. We want to have teachers be able to provide great lesson planning with streaming video in every classroom to 30 students using, a tablet type of device, and say, we need a Wi-Fi network to support that. However you want to design it and deploy it for us, pitch me how to do it, right? And I think the RFPs that get overly prescriptive just get themselves into trouble. The other thing I would say is, take some time to talk to all the stakeholders within the school district. So, definitely get the Board of Education on board with what you're doing and what you're planning on spending money for. I think they always typically do that. But take some time to get out there and talk with your curriculum advisors and the people that really know how to integrate technology into the classroom, and figure out, what your use case is before you go out and try to build the network. Because if you build it to a different use case and then you change your use case, let's say a year or two from now, that might require a lot of redesign effort in your network and continual spending of money. So, and then also third is funding. Are you going to buy the equipment yourself, which is a large capital investment? Or now we're seeing more and more with the managed services, especially kind of an OpEx type of pricing where they don't necessarily have to buy all the equipment up front. It's kind of like a lease to buy type of arrangement where they just pay a small monthly fee per AP, and it kind of avoid that huge budget hit or expenditure. So a lot of questions to consider, but I'd say it's it's all achievable.
Gotcha. Well, hey, I certainly appreciate your time today, Andrew. revolutionwifi.net, if I'm correct about it. Your blog.
Somebody owns it.
revolutionwifi.com is probably one of the best resources for very technical information around Wi-Fi.
No, it's not .com. It's .net.
Oh, that's what I said. Didn't I say Revolution?
I was saying .com somebody else owns.
Sorry.
No worries.
That's I mean, .net is always a good place to look for networking type content, but certainly a prolific a blog that's out there, probably the best, if not one of the best out there in terms of very technical information, a great resource for all of us that are out there. And we all appreciate the effort that you put into your site. Certainly appreciate you taking the time today. I think this has been a great conversation. If you want to take a moment to sign off, and maybe we'll close down after that.
Well, thanks, Mike, for having me. It's been my pleasure to be on your show. I love what you're doing with your on-the-fly Wi-Fi episodes. Keep it up, and look for the great content coming forward from you.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks a lot. Certainly thank all the viewers for tuning in today. Hopefully you got some good insights, particularly if you're out there building or buying or even selling into K-12 today. Again, Andrew Von Nagy, certainly appreciate your time, and thanks to all the viewers for tuning in today. With that, I'm going to sign off.